I'm standing outside of Singapore, Michigan, a town that was eventually supposed to rival Chicago until it got swallowed by that sand dune. It's story time.
Singapore was started in the mid-1830s by a group of investors and land speculators. Basically, people who bought land hoping that property values would someday go up and they'd make a nice chunk of change. But they also had a vision. They hoped that this place would eventually outcompete Chicago as a major Great Lakes port. And to do it, they'd ship a lot of wood. West Michigan had plenty of forests at this time, and since Singapore was located where the Kalamazoo River meets Lake Michigan, they were in an ideal spot to both make and ship a lot of lumber. The founders pictured stacks of the stuff going out from Singapore. They believed that this place would help raise the western frontier and make them a bunch of money along the way. They even gave their town an intriguing name, Singapore. To be clear, they probably didn't know much, if anything, about the Singapore on the other side of the globe. There weren't many immigrants from that part of the world in 1830s West Michigan. But to the people of this frontier town, the name probably sounded foreign and interesting. And you know what? Singapore, Michigan was gonna be interesting too. And if nothing else, it was at least busy. Over the years, there was a store, there was a good handful of houses, there was a boarding house, and true to the plan, there were several productive sawmills. But overall, growth was slower than you might think for a place that was supposed to outshine Chicago. Singapore was really more like a company work site than a proper town. There was no local government, there was barely any business outside the sawmills, and for years, the population never went above 200 people. Meanwhile, in the mid-1830s, when Singapore was founded, Chicago had about 4,000 people. And by 1850, when Singapore still only had a few hundred folks in town, Chicago had a population of almost 30,000. So the idea that Singapore would ever grow into this huge port city dissolved pretty quickly. I mean, it wasn't a totally bonkers idea. Singapore was supposed to be one of the endpoints of the Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal, which I talked about last video. If that had worked, it would have put Singapore on a major trade route. But, well, you can watch that story after this if you want to learn more. Still, population aside, the people of Singapore pressed on, and life probably had the sort of steady, quiet resilience you would expect from a frontier lumber town in the mid to late 1800s. Nearby Dutch families stopped by to buy beans, apples, and other supplies. For a while, Mr. Nichols kept the light on at the local lighthouse. Kids splashed along Lake Michigan and mingled with the Anishinaabe locals who often visited town, and so on. It was a simple, often challenging life. In fact, the fanciest thing in town was probably the money in the bank. In the 1830s, banking laws were a lot more relaxed than what we have today. It seemed like just about anybody could start a bank and print their own money. They were supposed to have enough gold and silver to back up those paper bills and actually give them value, but there are countless stories of these banks doing anything they could to get out of that. Things like sharing their gold and silver with other banks, or hiding a bunch of cheap iron underneath a layer of silver coins. It wasn't exactly FDIC insured. So the Bank of Singapore, which was founded in 1838, wasn't exactly trustworthy. Although I will say, given how tenuous its situation was, the artwork on these bills is intricate and beautiful. The elaborate artwork was to help prevent forgeries, but I'm still struck by how much detail there was on bills for this bank that, in the end, lasted less than a year. Because the bank didn't stick around. And in the long run, neither did the town. Singapore was supposed to grow to rival Chicago, but in the end, it helped rescue Chicago and doomed itself in the process. Singapore was founded in the mid-1830s, and for almost 40 years, the lumber mills did their thing, or at least tried their best. The mills kept burning down or closing thanks to hard times, so there wasn't always stability in Singapore. The first 10 years or so were particularly rough. But when the mills were running, people went out, cut down trees, branded them with these incredibly heavy hammers, and then sawed them into millions of board feet of nice, even lumber. For decades, folks came to work, kids walked to school, people fished in the lake. It may not have been an economic powerhouse, but it was still home. And then came 1871, a year that gave Singapore the chance to grow beyond its quiet frontier existence and become the place its founders had dreamed of. That year, tragically, almost 20,000 buildings in Chicago were destroyed by fire. A third of the city was left without homes. And to rebuild, they needed the one thing Singapore could provide: lumber, and a lot of it. The local mills and lumberjacks got to work cutting down as many trees as they could possibly find, and they shipped out stacks and stacks of boards to help rebuild Chicago and nearby cities. It was fast, lucrative work, and they were good at it. This was Singapore's chance to shine. The problem? Those trees had been holding back the sand. Lake Michigan is known for its gorgeous sandy beaches and towering dunes, and around Singapore, all that sand had been held in place for decades by the sturdy roots of all those trees. Once the dunes were gone, there was nothing to stop the sand from being swept up by the wind, to stop the dune from steadily moving over the town until the place was buried. And here's where I think the story starts to get really interesting and really human. Today, you'll see articles calling Singapore Michigan's Pompeii. That makes it sound like all the sand came in a day and catastrophically buried everyone's lives in the dust. But that's not what happened at all. This was a slow process. So slow that people had plenty of time to pack up and leave. Like, they had enough time that in the winter, some people literally picked up their houses and dragged them up the frozen Kalamazoo River. And also, they had plenty of reasons to leave, sand aside. After the trees around Singapore were cut down to rebuild Chicago, the mills didn't actually have much to do anymore. By the end of 1875, 4 years after the Great Fire, the mills had closed, and the equipment was being sent somewhere else. So by the time the sand really started moving in, the people were already on their way out. Now, they didn't take everything with them. Later accounts talk about the boarding house still being out there, about its chimney rising above the dune until even that disappeared. And in 2017, archaeologists found hundreds of artifacts of various kinds buried in the sand, all of which supported the Pompeii idea. But this wasn't Pompeii. The economy buried Singapore long before the sand did. But here's what I keep thinking about with this place. I think calling Singapore Michigan's Pompeii actually does it a bit of an injustice. Because what's so fascinating to me after spending a few days in this area, talking to locals and reading through everything I could get my hands on, is that Singapore didn't disappear, locked in time under the sand dunes. In many ways, it just evolved. If you visit the city of Saugatuck just up the road, you'll find echoes of Singapore everywhere. Like, this is one of the Singapore houses that was dragged up the river. It's now an Airbnb, so you can literally stay in a Singapore house. And if you want to visit the bank, briefly home to that beautiful currency, well, it's now an art gallery right on the main street. They picked it up and plopped it down in a more stable place. Today, the Singapore site itself is privately owned, and it's hard to get a look at from public land. Trust me, I tried. But from what I can tell, it seems like many people in Saugatuck feel a fondness for, or at least a fascination with, Singapore and its story. Over the years, there have been attempts to develop the town site, to turn the stretch of sand into some sort of housing, marina, golf course situation. But people have pushed back. There may not be a perfectly preserved city under the dune, but that spot still feels meaningful. It may not be Pompeii, but it is a piece of home and legacy. So to me, this story wasn't just interesting because a town got swallowed by a sand dune, although that is still one heck of a sentence and a good reminder of what happens when you misunderstand and abuse the environment. Looking around Saugatuck, this story feels interesting because it says a lot about how we experience home. How home is a place built by people who've had to move and change. How home is a place full of history that bubbles up in restaurant names and old houses and businesses. And how home also means looking toward the future and figuring out how to balance the dreams of tomorrow with the stories of the past. Singapore as it was will never exist again. But in many ways, the heart of the town lives on, hidden in plain sight in Saugatuck. You just have to know where to look. One of the challenging things about making this video was finding clear information about Singapore. Like, that Pompeii nickname looked credible until I read more closely, which is true with a lot of news, and which is why Ground News is the sponsor for this video. Rather than showing you one side of a story, they equip you with as much information as possible so that you can develop your own informed opinion. For instance, with this story about AI, you can see that 34 sources reported on it, you can see if they lean left or right, and you can see what the different spins are on the news. Here, some headlines paint this as something for the public good, others frame it as a big limitation, and some are in between. If I were on one of these websites and just read their headline, it would be easier for that publication to convince me to believe whatever that writer wants me to believe. It would be my only source of information. But with multiple perspectives laid out like this, it's easier to take in the big picture and develop my own opinions for myself. Ground News also allows you to just click the original source, so you can then check out that publication for yourself. I like Ground News because it feels like I have to do less work to be more informed. In life, I try to read perspectives that I agree with and ones that I don't. And I really appreciate that Ground News collects all of that information in one place so I can see what the different biases are and decide how I feel about that event. Unfortunately, they didn't have Ground News in the mid-1800s when Singapore was around, but what can you do? If you like this series, I think you'll find Ground News useful. And Ground News is giving y'all 40% off a Vantage subscription, which is the one I have, by going to ground.news/Alexis. That's ALEXIS. I do get people calling me Alexa sometimes. You can also click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Again, that's ground.news/Alexis. Thanks for considering the sponsors who support this series, and as always, thanks for being here. I hope you learned something that makes you think about the world just a little differently, and I'll see you soon.